Daniel Hart had never imagined his life would bring him inside the gilded halls of the Lancaster estate. To most, he was just a handyman. Steady hands, quiet eyes, and a toolbox worn smooth by years of use. But as he moved through the vast corridors of polished marble and gold-framed portraits, he was reminded every day of the distance between his world and hers. Clara Lancaster, the young heiress of the estate, lived surrounded by wealth and expectations. She was graceful, poised, and watched constantly by the judgmental eyes of high society. Yet when Daniel first saw her walking across the grand staircase, dressed not in diamonds but in a simple summer dress, he felt something stir in him that he could never put into words. For months, Daniel kept his affection locked deep inside. He fixed her family's crumbling walls, restored the carved banisters, and polished windows that reflected her image as she passed by. And though their worlds seemed impossibly far apart, he cherished the stolen moments when she would thank him with a kind smile or ask how the repairs were going. At night, when the estate fell silent, Daniel lingered longer than necessary. He would run his fingers across the wood he had restored, imagining it was part of something greater, an offering to the woman who unknowingly held his heart. But he never spoke of it. Love, he thought, was safer when hidden. And so he kept his secret in silence, unaware that fate was already moving, preparing the night when Clara would discover what he had so carefully guarded. Clara Lancaster had grown up in a world of privilege, yet it often felt like a cage. Every dinner, every outing, every conversation was wrapped in expectation. The city's elite wanted her to be a symbol of elegance, a reflection of the Lancaster legacy. But beneath the polished exterior, Clara longed for something simpler, something true. It was during one of her quiet escapes into the garden that she first truly noticed Daniel. He was repairing the iron gate at the far end of the estate, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the kind of strength born not of vanity, but of honest labor. His movements were deliberate, steady, almost graceful in their precision. Clara lingered for a moment, curious. "Does it ever tire you?" she asked softly, surprising herself as much as him, "to be fixing things all the time?" Daniel looked up, startled but respectful. His dark eyes met hers briefly before he answered, "Not when I know it can be made whole again." The words stayed with her long after she returned to the mansion. They were simple, yet they carried a depth she wasn't accustomed to hearing in the endless chatter of her wealthy peers. Over the following weeks, she found herself watching him more closely. She admired the quiet way he respected the estate, never rushing his work, never demanding attention. Unlike the men her family introduced to her, ambitious suitors cloaked in charm and entitlement, Daniel seemed content in silence, his dignity woven into the fabric of his labor. But what Clara could not see was that every time her gaze lingered, Daniel's heart ached. For within him lay a truth he could never share, a secret he feared would shatter the fragile balance of their unspoken connection. And yet, destiny had a way of unraveling even the most carefully guarded walls. The Lancaster mansion was a place where whispers carried farther than truth. Servants exchanged glances, visitors murmured in gilded corridors, and Clara often felt like every step she took was followed by invisible eyes. Yet when Daniel worked, the house seemed quieter. His presence steadied the chaos, as though the very walls trusted his touch. One evening, Clara descended the staircase to find him repairing the banister. The fading light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colors across the marble floor. For a moment she paused, watching. His hands moved with certainty, shaping the wood as if coaxing it back to life. "You make it look easy," she said, her voice echoing softly in the grand hall. Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes. "It's not about ease, it's about patience." Clara tilted her head, studying him. Most men she knew filled silence with bravado, eager to impress. Daniel's quiet words carried more weight than their endless speeches. She wondered what else lived in his silence. As he returned to work, Clara's mind wandered. She had heard rumors from the staff, half-spoken questions about who this handyman truly was. Some claimed he had been educated beyond his station. Others suggested he had once belonged to a family of influence before disappearing from society's gaze. Clara dismissed them at first, but now, watching him, she couldn't deny the air of mystery that clung to him. Daniel, meanwhile, fought to steady his heartbeat. Being near her, hearing her voice, was both a gift and a torment. He longed to tell her the truth, that his silence hid more than affection. But secrets were fragile things, and he feared that once spoken, they would change everything. Still, the house seemed to conspire against him. For every moment they shared, the distance between their worlds grew smaller, and the secret he carried pressed heavier against his chest. Clara's life was a parade of obligations. Invitations arrived daily, charity galas, luncheons with business partners, soirees where every gesture was scrutinized and every word weighed. She attended them with practiced grace, her smile as polished as the pearls around her neck. Yet beneath the glitter of chandeliers, she felt more like an actress on a stage than a woman truly living. At one such evening gathering, she sat at a long table surrounded by men in tailored suits, all vying for her attention with rehearsed compliments and shallow charm. Their voices droned on about wealth, expansion, and power. Clara's thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the quiet steadiness of Daniel sanding wood in the library, the way his eyes softened when he listened, the way his presence felt more real than all the grandeur around her. Later that night, when she returned to the estate, Clara found Daniel in the courtyard. He was repairing one of the lantern posts, his figure illuminated by the glow of a single flame. She hesitated in the shadows, watching him. There was no audience here, no mask to wear, just a man and his work. "You missed quite the evening," she said, stepping forward, her tone carrying a touch of irony. Daniel looked up, offering a faint smile. "I doubt I was invited." She laughed softly, surprising herself. "You would have been the most interesting man in the room." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Daniel's expression faltered for a moment, his eyes betraying something he quickly buried beneath calm composure. He lowered his gaze, tightening the lantern screws as though hiding behind the task. Clara sensed the shift, the tension that lived in the spaces between them. There was more to him than silence, more than work, and though she couldn't name it yet, she knew his secret was there, waiting in the quiet like a locked door she was destined to open. Rain fell steadily against the mansion windows, drumming a rhythm that filled the otherwise quiet halls. Clara sat in the library, a book open on her lap, though her eyes lingered on the fire instead of the words. She had been restless since the night in the courtyard. There was something in Daniel's silence, a weight in his gaze, that left her both curious and unsettled. As the rain pressed on, she wandered into the study her father once occupied. The air smelled faintly of old leather and polished oak. She traced her hand along the desk, only to notice a slip of parchment half tucked beneath a drawer. It wasn't hers, nor had she seen it before. With care, she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The words were brief but powerful. Lines that spoke of unspoken devotion, of a love carried in silence, a heart unable to reveal itself. Clara's breath caught as she read, her pulse quickening. The note was unsigned, yet something about its quiet intensity, its raw honesty, made her think of Daniel. Before she could reflect further, footsteps echoed in the hall. Startled, she folded the paper quickly and set it back in place. Daniel appeared in the doorway carrying tools, his hair damp from the rain. He paused upon seeing her there, his eyes flicking briefly to the desk before meeting hers. "Storm's loosening the shutters again," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Clara nodded, her heart racing. She wanted to ask him, wanted to hold up the letter and demand the truth, but instead she remained silent, unsure if she was ready for the answer. As Daniel disappeared down the corridor, the secret burned brighter within her. If the letter was his, then the walls of silence between them were thinner than she ever imagined. The storm passed, leaving the estate bathed in the glow of a clear night sky. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the fragrance of wet earth and blooming roses. Clara found herself wandering into the garden, her thoughts restless, circling back again and again to the letter. The words had carved themselves into her memory, their honesty unlike anything she had ever known. She walked toward the fountain, its waters shimmering under the moonlight, when she noticed Daniel nearby. He was kneeling by the stone path, securing loose tiles he had promised to fix. Even at night, he worked, as though the mansion itself depended on his care. "Do you ever rest?" Clara asked softly, stepping closer. Daniel looked up, the moonlight catching his features, highlighting the quiet strength in his expression. "Work keeps the mind steady," he replied. She hesitated, then moved nearer, her gown brushing against the damp grass. "And what about the heart?" she asked, her voice nearly a whisper. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Daniel's gaze held hers, and in that pause, Clara felt something unspoken reach across the distance. But then, with deliberate restraint, he returned to his work. "The heart is best kept quiet," he said. The answer stung, though it did not surprise her. Clara sensed that his words were not born of indifference, but of fear of breaking a line neither of them was supposed to cross. She lingered a moment longer, then turned toward the fountain, her reflection trembling in the rippling water. Behind her, Daniel remained bent over the stones, yet his hands moved slower, his focus faltering under the weight of what he refused to admit. That night, as Clara returned to her chamber, she realized his silence was not emptiness. It was a fortress, and inside it lived the very truth she longed to uncover. Autumn arrived with the rustle of falling leaves and the grand announcement of a charity ball at the Lancaster estate. Clara's family insisted she host, claiming it was her duty as heiress to maintain their standing. The mansion, once cloaked in quiet, now brimmed with activity. Chandeliers were polished, the ballroom floors gleamed, and silken drapes cascaded like rivers of color. Daniel worked silently among the preparations, repairing loose steps on the staircase and ensuring the lanterns glowed without fault. He moved in the background, unnoticed by the guests who would soon fill the house, yet Clara's eyes sought him even in the bustle. She felt the growing ache of his distance, the invisible wall he maintained between them. On the night of the ball, Clara stood in a gown of silver and pearl, the very image of elegance. Music swelled as dancers glided across the floor, their laughter echoing under the crystal lights. She smiled where she was expected to, speaking with dignitaries and suitors, but her thoughts drifted toward the shadows at the edge of the room, where Daniel stood quietly, ensuring all ran smoothly. Their eyes met once, across the expanse of wealth and expectation. In that fleeting glance, Clara saw the truth he tried so hard to bury, the affection in his gaze, the longing quickly hidden when he turned away. Later, as the music softened and the crowd swirled around her, Clara realized the cruel irony. Surrounded by countless admirers, she had never felt more alone. The only man whose presence she craved remained unreachable, bound by silence and circumstance. And Daniel, watching from the distance, felt the same torment. For while the world danced around her, he stood anchored in the shadows, his secret pressing harder against the silence he could no longer keep forever. When the last carriage wheels faded into the night and the ball had ended, silence returned to the mansion. The grand chandeliers still glimmered faintly, and the scent of perfume and wine lingered in the air. Clara dismissed the servants early, needing solitude after hours of forced smiles and shallow conversations. But as she entered the drawing room, she found Daniel there, quietly tending to the fire. The flicker of the flames illuminated his features, softening the roughness of his hands and casting shadows that made his eyes seem deeper, more haunted. Clara paused in the doorway, her gown still heavy with jewels, feeling suddenly stripped of all the masks she had worn that evening. "You work even after the guests have gone," she said gently. Daniel set aside the poker, his voice low. "Someone has to keep the fire burning." She moved closer, her steps slow across the polished floor. "And who keeps yours burning, Daniel?" The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it. For a moment he said nothing. His gaze met hers, and Clara felt as if the air itself held its breath. Then he looked away, retreating behind his silence once more. "Some fires aren't meant to be shared," he murmured. Clara's heart ached at his restraint. She wanted to reach across the distance, to pull the truth from him, but she sensed the weight of whatever secret he carried. Instead, she lowered herself into the chair opposite him, the fire crackling between them. They sat there, surrounded by warmth and unspoken words. Clara realized then that she did not fear his silence. She feared what it concealed. And though the fire glowed brightly, it was the shadows in his eyes that kept her awake long after the night had passed. The days after the ball carried a strange tension through the estate. Clara found herself lingering near the places Daniel worked, her curiosity no longer content with half answers and silence. She sensed his secret pressing at the edges of every glance, every pause in his speech. It was as though he carried two lives, one visible in his work and another hidden behind the steady mask he never allowed to slip. One afternoon, Clara entered the library and found him restoring the carved mantel above the fireplace. The scent of fresh varnish mingled with the faint perfume of roses drifting in from the garden. She stood quietly for a moment, then spoke. "Daniel," she began softly, "I found something in my father's study the other night. A letter." His hand stilled against the wood, his shoulders tightening ever so slightly. Slowly he turned, his eyes searching hers. "A letter?" Clara nodded. "It was unfinished. Words about devotion, about silence, about love. It wasn't signed, but I think I know who wrote it." For a long moment Daniel said nothing. The silence between them roared louder than any storm. Clara's heart pounded, waiting, willing him to speak. She saw in his face the battle he fought, the urge to confess against the fear of what truth might destroy. At last, he lowered his gaze, his voice quiet. "Some truths are heavier than they seem. Sometimes, silence is the only way to protect what matters." The words cut deep. Clara wanted to protest, to demand he break the walls around his heart, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't indifference. It was pain. A pain so raw, it told her that his secret was not just about love. It was tied to something larger, something that bound him in chains she could not yet see. And so the letter remained unanswered, and his secret for now stayed in the shadows. The following evening, Clara walked the long corridor lined with ancestral portraits. Generations of Lancasters gazed down at her with stern faces, symbols of wealth and duty. She felt their weight pressing against her, the same weight Daniel seemed to carry in silence. Later, she found him in the old stables, mending a broken door. The lantern light flickered across his face, revealing weariness not from work alone, but from something buried deeper. Clara stepped closer, unable to hold back her thoughts any longer. "Why do you hide from me?" she asked softly. "It isn't just shyness. It's something more." Daniel set down his tools, his breath heavy in the cool night air. For a moment he leaned against the wooden beam, as if gathering strength. Then he spoke, his voice steady, but laced with old sorrow. "I was not always a handyman," he admitted. "Once I belonged to a family with a name people recognized, but choices mine and others, stripped it away. What remains of that life is nothing but shadow. I came here to work, not to be remembered. Clara's heart raced. His words confirmed what she had suspected, that he was no ordinary man, no mere stranger passing through. She saw the truth in the way he carried himself, in the quiet dignity that lingered beneath every movement. "Why keep it hidden?" she pressed gently. His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "Because secrets tied to bloodlines have power. To reveal them could change everything, not just for me, but for you." The confession, though incomplete, was enough to shake her. Clara realized his silence was not cowardice, but sacrifice, a shield he held not for himself, but for her. And for the first time, she wondered if his secret was not simply about love, but about protecting her from a truth larger than them both. The mansion seemed quieter in the days after Daniel's partial confession. Clara carried his words with her like a hidden weight, replaying them in the solitude of her chamber, in the pauses between her duties, even in her dreams. He was not the man he appeared to be, at least not entirely. And though he still kept the full truth locked away, she could feel its edges pressing against the silence. One afternoon, her aunt arrived unexpectedly, a woman sharp as glass and twice as cold. She spoke endlessly about Clara's responsibility to marry well, to secure alliances, to ensure the Lancaster fortune remained untarnished. Names of wealthy heirs were spoken, men Clara could scarcely bear to look at without feeling suffocated. But as her aunt lectured in the parlor, Clara's thoughts wandered to Daniel's hands, smoothing old wood, to his voice steady in storms, to the way he saw her not as an heiress but simply as herself. The conflict tore at her, the life laid out for her by duty, or the life she secretly longed for, fragile and uncertain though it might be. That evening Clara escaped to the veranda, where the night air was cool and the stars stretched endlessly above. She found Daniel there, checking the lanterns along the stone railing. Their eyes met, and for once, she let her guard fall. "I am expected to marry a man I cannot respect," she confessed, her voice breaking. "And yet the one man I—" She faltered, the words trembling on her lips. Daniel stepped closer, the firelight from the lanterns catching the struggle in his expression. "Clara," he said quietly, "there are lines we are not meant to cross." But his tone betrayed him. It wasn't conviction. It was longing, restrained. And Clara knew then that the battle between duty and desire was no longer hers alone to fight. The tension in the Lancaster mansion had grown unbearable. Clara could no longer ignore the whispers of her own heart, nor the secret she knew Daniel still carried. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered through the halls, her bare feet silent against the cold marble. The house seemed to breathe with her, every shadow urging her forward. She found him in the study, the same room where she had discovered the unfinished letter. Daniel stood by the window, the moonlight falling across his face, his hands clenched as though holding back words he could no longer contain. Clara entered quietly, but he sensed her presence. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, though his voice lacked the conviction to send her away. Clara stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. "And yet, here I am. Daniel, I can't live surrounded by secrets anymore. If you carry something that belongs to me, if you love me as I think you do, say it." The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Daniel turned, his expression torn between fear and surrender. He reached into his jacket and drew out a folded letter, the same handwriting she had found before. He placed it on the desk between them, his hand lingering on it for a heartbeat before letting go. "I wrote it," he confessed, his voice low. "Every word was mine. I have loved you in silence, Clara, loved you from the moment I saw you, though I swore I would never burden you with it. My secret was not just love. It was the truth of who I was before this life. I am not the man you think, but I could not let that past define me in your eyes." Clara's breath caught, her chest tightening. The secret was out, laid bare in the flicker of moonlight. And in that moment, everything changed. Clara stared at the letter on the desk, her hands trembling as she touched the paper that carried Daniel's heart. The words she had longed to hear were there, etched in ink, but now spoken aloud in his voice. They carried a weight far greater than she imagined. For so long, her life had been dictated by duty, by appearances, by expectations she never chose. Yet in Daniel's confession, she found something no wealth or legacy could offer: truth, raw, unpolished, and real. She lifted her gaze to him. "You loved me in silence," she whispered, "while I searched for honesty in a world built on lies. Do you not see? You've given me more than anyone else ever has." Daniel shook his head slightly, as though struggling to believe her. "But Clara, your world and mine." She stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Worlds can be rebuilt, Daniel. You've proven that with every wall you've restored in this house. And if you can breathe life back into stone and wood, why should we think love is any less possible?" For the first time, Daniel allowed the fortress of his silence to fall. His hand reached for hers, rough from years of work, meeting the delicate grace of her fingers. In that simple touch, the mansion seemed to breathe, its shadows retreating as though the house itself recognized the shift. The heiress and the handyman stood together, not as symbols of class or expectation, but as two souls who had found each other against all odds. Love, born in silence, had finally spoken. And in the quiet of that night, the Lancaster estate was no longer a place of secrets. It was a home where truth and love could dwell without walls.